Hey everyone, it's me, Rigatoni Jack. Before we dive into today's story, if you enjoy these real-life tales, hit that subscribe button. Here's the thing about life-changing moments. They rarely announce themselves. Sometimes they masquerade as ordinary decisions, like accepting an invitation to a European cruise or, in my case, popping what seemed to be a harmless pimple. It was June, and my friends had invited me on what sounded like a dream vacation. An all-expenses-paid cruise around Europe. Me, who had never even left the country before. Of course I said yes. Of course I got my passport. Of course I packed my favourite tank tops. Rome was everything I'd imagined and more. The Colosseum stood against the sky like an ancient giant, and the Vatican took my breath away with its grandeur. Everything was perfect until I noticed that tiny bump in my armpit. You know how everyone tells you not to pop pimples? Listen to them, really. But I didn't. I gave it a squeeze, felt that satisfaction of a job well done, and went about my business exploring Barcelona in my tank top. The Mediterranean sun beat down at 104 degrees as we walked, 90 miles in 8 days, if you can believe it. Meanwhile, that former pimple was staging a rebellion. What started as a small lump grew into something the size of a golf ball, then bigger. It was like hosting my own personal alien invasion under my arm. By the last day, my left arm couldn't lower. The mass had grown to the size of my fist, and every movement felt like being stabbed with a rusty fork. The 16-hour flight home was pure torture. Imagine being stuck in a metal tube thousands of feet in the air, with your arm forced out like you're perpetually trying to answer a question in class. And then, because the universe has a twisted sense of humour, I found myself in the emergency room right as the clock struck midnight on my 20th birthday. Happy birthday to me, right? The doctor, bless his heart, tried morphine first. But here's a fun medical fact I learned that night. Pus can counteract painkillers. So when he came at me with that scalpel, I felt everything, every single thing. Have you ever screamed so loud you forgot how to breathe? Have you ever seen infection spray across a doctor's face mask like some horrible B-movie special effect? Now I have. But wait, the story gets better or worse, depending on how you look at it. Picture this, it's 3 a.m. I'm standing outside the hospital with blood seeping through my shirt, holding a bag of antibiotics, when this massive man appears like a character from a Stephen King novel, asking about McDonald's and using words that would make your grandmother faint. The next 6 weeks became a blur of urgent care visits, more cutting, more squeezing, more screaming. Every 3 days, like clockwork, 6 shots in the armpit, because apparently I hadn't suffered enough. Scalpel work that would make a horror movie director squirm, and the stuffing of surgical wick into the wound. The sounds, oh God, the sounds. They're permanently etched into my memory like a bad tattoo. Now I have this impressive scar under my arm. It's quite the conversation starter at parties, though I usually wait until after people have finished eating to tell the story. And hey, at least I learned something from all this. When it comes to pimples, just let them be. They know what they're doing. Sometimes the best life lessons come wrapped in the most painful packages, or in my case, hiding in an armpit, waiting to turn a dream European vacation into a medical nightmare. But at least it makes for a good story, right? Story 2. Here's the thing about being an adult. No one really teaches you when something is actually an emergency. Like, there's no manual that says, Chapter 7, how to determine if your stomach pain warrants a trip to the emergency room. And that's how I found myself living through what I now refer to as the great gastrointestinal misunderstanding of March. It started on what should have been a perfect Saturday morning. You know, the kind where sunlight streams through your windows in that particular way that makes dust particles dance like tiny cosmic ballerinas. Except I couldn't appreciate any of that because my stomach felt like it was hosting its own heavyweight boxing championship. Hours passed and the pain grew from, maybe I shouldn't have had that questionable takeout, to, this is definitely how I die. When I called the hospital, because that's what responsible adults do, right? They heard the magic word combination of severe abdominal pain and right side, and immediately went into appendicitis protocol mode. So there I was, being a supposedly responsible adult, walking into the emergency room, convinced that some part of my body had decided to stage a rebellion. What followed was a medical symphony of sorts. The rhythmic beeping of machines, the percussion of nurses inserting IVs, the steady flow of blood draws, and the grand finale, a CT scan that made me feel like I was auditioning for a sci-fi movie. And then came the plot twist. The doctor walked in with the kind of expression that suggested either very good news or very bad news. There's really no in-between with doctor expressions. He looked at his charts, looked at me, and delivered the diagnosis that would cost me exactly $7,000. I needed to poop. That's it. No appendicitis, no mysterious illness, no alien invasion of my digestive tract. Just good old-fashioned constipation that could have been solved with a $5 bottle of over-the-counter medicine. The thing is, they don't prepare you for this moment in health class. They teach you about the mitochondria being the powerhouse of the cell. But nobody mentions that sometimes the most expensive thing you'll ever do is panic about having to use the bathroom. So now I have what might be the most expensive poop story in history, and a new policy about hospital visits that basically amounts to, unless I can actually see my own bones or am actively turning into a supernatural creature, I'm trying everything else first. Because sometimes the most expensive lessons in life aren't about love or loss or following your dreams. Sometimes they're about learning the difference between an emergency and really needing to visit the bathroom, and that's okay too. That's just part of the infinitely awkward experience of being human. If you're cringing right now, drop an emoji in the comments, and trust me, it gets even better. Story 3. There are moments when you realize that the person you're pretending to be has somehow taken over the person you actually are, like a shadow becoming more substantial than the thing casting it. This was one of those moments. It started simply enough. A Tinder match, a restaurant date in Gainesville, a bus ride there because my moped decided last week that it needed a break from existence. Already the universe was conspiring to make this night more complicated than it needed to be. The first 5 minutes were filled with that particular kind of small talk that makes you wonder if humans were ever meant to date at all. Weather, cold weather, more cold weather. The kind of conversation that makes you want to do something, anything, to prove you're more interesting than the temperature outside. That's when I remembered the trick, the life hack, the clever little deception that people share online like trading cards of minor rebellion. Ask for fresh guacamole by claiming you're allergic to onions. It seemed harmless at the time, like most bad decisions do. My date was impressed. Of course she was impressed. There's something seductive about small acts of deception, about thinking you're getting away with something. Damn, I'm stealing this one, she said, and I felt clever, special, like I had passed some test of ingenuity that would make this night memorable. But here's the thing about lies. They're never really under your control. They're like those trick birthday candles that keep relighting themselves, no matter how many times you try to blow them out. The waitress came running, frantic, concerned, professional, about the onions in my entree. The manager appeared like a manifestation of my guilt, and suddenly I was coughing, performing an allergy I knew nothing about, trapped in a spiral of my own creation. My date's face transformed from amusement to something else entirely, something that made me realize that sometimes the difference between charm and deception is just a matter of perspective. The rest unfolds like a comedy of errors, except I'm the only one who knows it's supposed to be funny. The manager insisting on driving me to the emergency room, me sitting in his car trying to find the right moment to end this charade but realizing there isn't one. The empty emergency room waiting area, where I had to tell a nurse I was having an allergic reaction, while being painfully aware that the only thing I was actually allergic to was honesty. $500. That's what it costs to maintain a lie these days, plus $25 for the Uber ride home, because apparently the universe believes in adding insult to injury, or maybe it's the other way around. My friend called me the worst kind of arsehole when I told her. She's probably right. There's something particularly awful about pretending to have a medical condition in a world where so many people actually struggle with them. It's like making fun of someone's pain just to get better guacamole. The date never texted back. I don't blame her. Who wants to be with someone who turns a simple dinner into a medical emergency just because they wanted fresh guacamole? Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had just eaten the regular guacamole, talked about the weather for a few more minutes, and let the evening unfold naturally. But that's the thing about choices. You never really know the cost until you're already paying it. So here I am, $500 poorer, one Tinder match fewer, and hopefully a little wiser. Because sometimes the lessons we need to learn come with a bill attached, and sometimes that bill includes a single dose of Benadryl for an allergy I never had. Story 4. Okay, so Let me start by saying something kind of embarrassing. I've been trying this whole no self-love thing for about a month. You know what I mean? I was trying to be less impulsive, more disciplined, whatever. But here's where things get interesting. And by interesting, I mean mortifying. Picture this. It's a totally normal morning. I'm doing my usual routine, shower, shave, getting ready for another thrilling day of college classes, nothing out of the ordinary. Then bam, out of nowhere, this absolutely excruciating pain hits me right in the, well, let's just say the family jewels. And when I say excruciating, I mean drop to your knees, seeing stars kind of pain. Like someone kicked me with steel-toed boots. Multiple times, I had to sit down, just sit and breathe. Every tiny movement felt like torture. I seriously considered heading straight to the emergency room, but being the stubborn idiot I am, I decided to try making it through my first class. Big mistake. Huge mistake. Sitting through that lecture was like being in some kind of twisted time warp where minutes stretched into hours. The pain would ease up just enough to give me hope, then come crashing back like a tidal wave. I was sweating so much people probably thought I was having a mental breakdown, which, honestly, not far from the truth. Finally, I had to make possibly the most awkward phone call of my life. "Hey mum," I said, trying to sound casual. "So, funny story, any chance you could take me to the emergency room? My, lower region feels like it got trampled by a herd of elephants." Thank God my mum is cool. Like, seriously cool. No judgment, no awkward questions, just straight into action mode. The ER was exactly as fun as you'd expect. Hours of waiting, changed into one of those stylish hospital gowns that definitely aren't designed for dignity. More waiting, blood tests, urine samples, an ultrasound, talk about awkward. Even more waiting, and then plot twist. Everything was completely normal, like medically perfect. They couldn't find anything wrong, but here's the kicker. The real punchline of this whole ridiculous situation. That night I had the most epic, nocturnal emission of my life. We're talking biblical proportions here. Had to change everything, flip the mattress, the whole deal. And that's when it hit me. That morning, before the great testicle emergency, I'd woken up from this intense dream. But the pain had completely wiped it from my memory. Basically, I'd blue-balled myself so hard I ended up in the ER. So yeah, that happened. I spent an entire day in the emergency room, worried I was dying, had my parents waste their whole day, probably racked up a nice medical bill. All because I was trying to be disciplined. The moral of the story? Sometimes trying to be too responsible can literally be a pain in the, well, you know where. At least it'll make a great story someday. Maybe. Probably not at family dinners though. And hey, better safe than sorry when it comes to that particular area, right? Right? Story 5. There I am living my best life, or what I thought was my best life, doing the whole drinking and partying thing with this coworker who, let's be real, was way out of my league. And because I'm an absolute genius, note the sarcasm, I decided to get extra, romantic. Everything seemed totally fine at first, like seriously fine. No warning signs, no red flags, nothing. But then things got weird. And by weird, I mean there was this smell that made me seriously question all my life choices up to that point. But did I stop? Of course not, because I am clearly a champion of poor decision making. Fast forward to the next day, my throat feels like I swallowed a cactus, but I'm like, whatever, it's probably just from all the drinking and smoking, right? Wrong. So wrong. 2 days later, my left tonsil looks like something out of a horror movie. We're talking triple size, multicolored nightmare fuel. Black, green, white, the whole rainbow of oh no. And the pain? Imagine getting punched in the throat by the Incredible Hulk. That's putting it mildly. So I drag myself to MedExpress, thinking they'll give me some magic pills and send me on my way. The doctor takes one look in my mouth and his face does this thing. You know that face doctors make when they're trying not to freak you out, but they're definitely freaking out. That face. He's like, yeah, you need to go to the ER. And I'm like, the ER? Are you serious right now? And he's all, this thing is spreading faster than gossip in a high school cafeteria. So there I am, sitting in the ER, feeling like death warmed over, waiting for yet another doctor to tell me how spectacularly I've messed up. This new doctor comes in, takes one look and goes, "We're gonna have to stick a needle in there." Needle in my tonsil. Let me tell you something about having a needle stuck in your tonsil. It's not great. Actually, that's an understatement. It's like the opposite of great. It's whatever word means. This is the worst thing ever, and I'm questioning every decision that led me to this moment. But hey, at least I got some nice parting gifts. Painkillers, yay. Steroids for the swelling, double yay. And amoxicillin, triple yay. Oh, and a healthy dose of trauma to remember it all by. Moral of the story, maybe just don't do what I did, or at least get better at making life choices. I don't know, I'm clearly not qualified to give advice. Story 6. Let me tell you about the day I thought I was dying, but actually just learned an important lesson about portion control. Specifically, cookie portion control. Even more specifically, red velvet cookie portion control. It was a perfectly normal December morning at work. Well, normal until approximately 9 a.m. when I made a rather alarming discovery in the bathroom. Upon completing my morning constitutional and doing the customary paper check, I saw something that made my heart stop. Red. Lots of red. My face went from normal human color to ghost white in approximately 0.2 seconds. I am not exaggerating when I say I could actually feel the blood draining from my face, which was ironic given my current situation. I stumbled to my supervisor's office, probably looking like an extra from a zombie movie. "I need to go to the ER, I managed to say. My supervisor took one look at my face and said, "Yes, you do." The emergency room was mercifully close to my office. On my way there, I sent exactly one text message to exactly one friend. Because when you think you might be dying, you want at least one person to know where to find your body. Morbid? Perhaps. But these were desperate times. Now, there's a special circle of awkward reserved for explaining certain medical situations to ER reception staff. The conversation went something like this. "Reception, what brings you in today?" Me. There's red when there shouldn't be red. Reception. "I see." She did not see, but she was professional enough to pretend she did. Here's the thing about my family medical history. We have a greatest hits collection of digestive issues, including the crowd favorite colitis, also featuring special guest star cancer. So naturally, my brain went straight to WebMD's greatest hits of terrible diagnoses. The next part of my adventure involved removing my pants and lying face down on an exam table while a doctor announced he was going to examine my nether regions. As I lay there, face pressed against paper-covered vinyl, I wondered if this day could possibly get any more mortifying. Spoiler alert, it could. The doctor did his examination, took some samples, and left me alone with my thoughts and my podcasts for what felt like several eternities. When he returned, his face had an interesting expression. The kind of expression that says, "I have good news, but you're not going to like why it's good news." "It's not blood," he said. Relief flooded through me for approximately half a second before being replaced by dawning horror. Let me back up for a moment. I should mention that in my friend group, I am known as the cookie monster. Not the furry blue kind, but the human kind who has never met a cookie they didn't like. This reputation is well earned and extensively documented. The night before this incident, I had gone to Target. Holiday Target, December Target, Target in its final form. I bought decorations, lights, a tree topper, and, fatefully, cookie mix. Red velvet cookie mix. That evening, while decking my halls, I baked those cookies. I told myself I would eat 2, then 4, then just finish the container. Then, when sleep proved elusive, I decided to have a midnight snack, like Santa. Unlike Santa, I ate the entire box of red velvet cookies in one sitting. Back in the exam room, the doctor asked if I had consumed anything with red food coloring. The pieces clicked into place. I've never seen medical professionals try so hard not to laugh. The nurses behind the curtain weren't quite as successful. I could hear the exact moment they lost it, and really, who could blame them? I'd rushed to the emergency room, convinced I was dying because I had eaten an entire box of red velvet cookies. I cleaned up, got dressed, and walked out of that ER a changed person. still the cookie monster, but now with a healthy respect for red food colouring and a story I would never live down. Some lessons you learn the easy way. Some lessons you learn while lying face down in an ER with lubricated medical instruments, investigating the consequences of your cookie addiction. I chose the latter path. Learn from my mistakes. Respect the red velvet. Story 7. Sometimes the smallest requests can lead to the most unexpected outcomes. That's what I learned on a Thursday evening that started routinely enough but ended in fluorescent lit hospital corridors. My friend and I had been seeing each other casually for several months. We were comfortable together, but I wanted more connection, more intimacy. During an intimate moment, I made what seemed like a simple request for eye contact. When he hesitated, I persisted, making it a condition to continue. I didn't realize then how overwhelming such a request could be for some people. What happened next was like watching a scene unfold in slow motion. His eyes met mine, held for a moment, and then rolled back. His body went limp. The room suddenly felt very cold and very quiet. I called 911 immediately. The paramedics arrived quickly, their questions sharp and practical. Even after he regained consciousness, something wasn't right. He seemed distant, confused. The medical team diagnosed him with mild syncope, a fancy word for fainting that sounds more serious than it should. We spent hours in the emergency room. The steady beep of monitors and the squeak of nurses' shoes on linoleum became our soundtrack. I stayed by his side, watching the IV drip and thinking about how a moment of intimacy had turned into a medical emergency. The worst part wasn't the scary moment of his collapse or the long wait in the ER. It was knowing that in our American healthcare system, this unexpected visit would come with a hefty price tag. Even though he assured me it was okay, the guilt weighed heavily on my conscience. Later, we talked about what happened. To be clear, he had wanted to continue our intimate moment. His reluctance had only been about the eye contact, not about the act itself. When he finally agreed to look at me, it proved too intense. Sometimes our bodies react in ways we can't predict or control. I learned something important that night about the complex nature of intimacy. What seems simple to one person might be overwhelming to another, and sometimes the desire for connection needs to be balanced with sensitivity to another's boundaries, even when they're hard to understand. In the end, we were both okay, though perhaps a bit wiser. And definitely poorer thanks to our healthcare system. But that's another story entirely. Story 8. Here's what happened. I am 20 years old. I am Latina. These facts matter. The first time the pain hit, it was random. Just a Tuesday, just another day. The pain started in my chest, crushing, like someone was squeezing my heart in their fist. I thought it would pass. It didn't pass. 20 minutes later, I was sweating, vomiting. The pain had transformed into something monstrous. The kind of pain that makes you wonder if you're dying. My friends drove me to the emergency room. 3 hours I waited. 3 hours of agony. The doctor barely looked at me. He asked where I was really from. He didn't order blood work, didn't really examine me, just said acid reflux. I said, but the pain... He cut me off. Had it once myself, really hurts. That was that. My mother called later. That doesn't sound like acid reflux, she said. But I trusted the doctor because that's what we're supposed to do, right? 2 weeks passed, then it happened again. 8 hours I waited at home thinking, it's just acid reflux. The medicine will work, the medicine will work, the medicine will work. It didn't work. Back to the ER. This time a different doctor. He was calm, unbothered. You were just here, he said. Your blood work was fine. They never did blood work, I told him. His face changed. Tests revealed the truth. Gallstones. My enzymes were all wrong. They sent me home with hydrocodone and told me to call Monday about surgery. 12 hours later, I was back. The pain was worse, much worse. The nurses took blood, acting like this was routine. Nothing to worry about. But my numbers were bad, very bad. What should have been 1 simple surgery became 2. What should have been a same-day procedure became 4 days in the hospital. What should have been nothing became everything. My mother had to fly in, rent a car, get a hotel, take care of her daughter who was supposed to be taking care of herself at college. Now I sit here thinking about the bills that will come. 3 ER visits, 2 surgeries, 4 days in the hospital. And I wonder, would they have done the blood work the first time if I looked different, if I was older, if I wasn't who I am? These questions have no answers, but they matter. They matter a lot. If you've ever panicked about a medical issue, hit that like button. You're not alone. Story 9. Have you ever had one of those days where everything goes wrong? Well, let me tell you about a college student who had the most embarrassing day ever. This student was super tired from studying all day for a really important test. Their teacher, Professor Thompson, was known as the toughest teacher in school. He never smiled, rarely gave out A's, and always seemed grumpy. After studying for hours and hours, the student decided to take a break and use a new friend-making app on their phone. They matched with someone who lived nearby and decided to go visit them. But here's where things got really awkward. It turned out that the new friend lived in Professor Thompson's house. It was his daughter. Neither of them knew this until Professor Thompson came home early from work. He walked in and saw the student sitting in his living room. Professor Thompson's face turned as red as a tomato. "Get out of my house!" He yelled so loud that the student thought the windows might break. The student ran all the way back to their dorm room, feeling more embarrassed than they'd ever felt in their whole life. How would they ever face Professor Thompson in class the next day? But when they went to class the next morning, something surprising happened. Professor Thompson wasn't there. Instead, another teacher came in and said Professor Thompson had a family emergency and won't be here today. The student thought they were safe, but then they got an email from Professor Thompson. It said, "Please come to a meeting tomorrow with me, my wife, and the school principal to talk about what happened." The student was worried, but they knew they hadn't done anything really wrong. They had just made a new friend using an app. They just didn't know it was their teacher's daughter. Still, they were nervous about the meeting. The lesson here? Maybe it's better to meet new friends through school clubs or sports teams instead of apps. And definitely make sure you know whose house you're visiting before you go there. Also, when you're super stressed about studying, sometimes it's better to just take a nap or read a book instead of looking for new friends. That way you won't accidentally end up in your grumpy teacher's living room. The student still doesn't know what will happen at the meeting, but they learned an important lesson about being more careful about meeting new people. Sometimes the most embarrassing moments in life teach us the best lessons. Story 10. There are some decisions in life that seem questionable even while you're making them. Like agreeing to join your former boss and her husband for what they euphemistically called an intimate evening. I should have known better, but hindsight is always crystal clear, isn't it? I met Sarah, not her real name, obviously, when she was my supervisor at my previous job. We had history, the kind that involves too much office party wine and regrettable choices. Now she was married to Derek, and they had specific interests in their relationship. The restaurant where we met was one of those trendy fusion places with mood lighting that's supposed to make everyone look better. I agreed to meet them there mostly because I remembered the food being excellent. Sarah sat across from me, all perfectly maintained blonde hair and calculated smiles, while Derek excused himself to the restroom. "We should discuss what happened last time," Sarah said, stirring her drink with one of those tiny black straws. "I think we can make it better." I pushed my noodles around my plate, wondering how I'd ended up in this conversation. The last time she referred to had been a disaster of epic proportions. Derek had fallen asleep during our arrangement. Not just a gentle doze, mind you, but a full-on snoring symphony with some particularly musical digestive accompaniment. When Derek returned, he carried himself with the awkward energy of someone who knew exactly what we were discussing. "You were too quiet," he said, pointing his chopsticks at me like they were accusatory fingers. "How's anyone supposed to stay engaged when you're silent as a mime?" "I'm sorry my performance wasn't theatrical enough for you," I replied, feeling a surge of defensive sarcasm. It's not exactly natural performing for an audience who's providing their own sound effects. Sarah pushed her plate away, her perfectly shaped eyebrows drawing together. "Maybe we need to establish some ground rules. Maybe we need to accept this isn't working," I interrupted, finally finding my voice. "Look, I know someone who might be better suited for this kind of thing." Sarah's face fell, but Derek perked up. "Tell us more," he said, while his wife shot him a look that could have frozen soup. I should have stopped there, should have walked away. Instead, I introduced them to my friend Mike, thinking I was doing everyone a favour. A week later, Mike called me with a story that belonged in a sitcom. Something about Derek's pit bull playing audience member and Derek acting as some sort of canine interpreter during their encounter. "You could have warned me about the dog," Mike said, his voice a mixture of disbelief and annoyance. "I didn't know about the dog," I replied, trying not to laugh and failing miserably. "The husband kept translating the dog's barks like some sort of deranged Dr. Dolittle," Mike continued. "Then he slapped my butt and called me good boy. I'm never trusting your referrals again." That was the moment I finally did what I should have done weeks ago. I blocked Sarah's number. Some doors are better left closed, some boundaries better left uncrossed, and some ex-bosses better left in the past. Mike still gives me the side eye whenever we meet for coffee. I've promised to make it up to him somehow, though I'm not sure there's a friendship apology card that covers, "Sorry, I accidentally sent you into a bizarre bedroom situation with my ex-boss, her husband, and their amateur dog whispering." Life lessons come in strange packages sometimes. This one came with a side of sushi and a reminder that not all second chances deserve to be taken. Story 11. The thing about memories is that they don't arrive in chronological order. Sometimes they come to us sideways years later when we're walking down a street on an ordinary day and suddenly everything makes terrible, beautiful sense. This is a story that began in 2001, though I didn't understand all of its pieces until recently. My first wife, Sarah, mother of my 2 sons, lover of Xena warrior princess, wearer of Celtic armbands, died after a tragic series of events that started with a simple pinch of skin. Let me tell you about Sarah. She had epilepsy, which means her brain would sometimes misfire in spectacular and terrifying ways. On that day in 2001, she was getting ready to visit her mother. I can still picture her adjusting her Celtic armband, not the basketball team, but the kind warriors might have worn in ancient Ireland. She accidentally pinched her arm while securing it, and that small trauma triggered a grand mal seizure. The next part is where everything went wrong, though I wouldn't understand exactly how wrong for 20 years. At the emergency room, I tried explaining everything to the doctor about her epilepsy, about the armband, about the pinch. While describing what happened, I made a motion with my hands, demonstrating how she had been adjusting the band on her upper arm. It was such a simple gesture meant to help, but sometimes the simplest things can be catastrophically misunderstood. The ER doctor became fixated on the idea that Sarah was using drugs. He refused to administer anti-seizure medication. He wouldn't order an EEG to monitor her brain activity. Instead, he put her under sedation for 38 hours. And yes, I counted every excruciating minute. She remained paralyzed, making it impossible to tell if she was still seizing. She never woke up. For 2 decades, I carried a burning question. Why was that doctor so convinced about drugs, even after the toxicology reports came back clean? I assumed it was a prejudice. We were poor. Sarah had a punk rock style, and sometimes people make awful assumptions. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn, the kind that only real life can write. Recently, my current wife, Gina, and I were walking to my son's football game, discussing how skin pinches can trigger seizures. As I demonstrated Sarah's armband adjusting motion, a stranger passing by made a startling comment about heroin use. And suddenly 20 years of confusion crystallized into understanding. That simple gesture I'd made in the ER, the motion of adjusting an armband, could have looked exactly like something else entirely from across a room. The doctor, watching from his desk, saw a pantomime without its context and made a fatal assumption. The truth is, understanding doesn't make the loss any easier. It doesn't bring Sarah back or erase those 38 hours. But it does remind us that sometimes the worst moments of our lives aren't born from malice, but from misunderstanding. Sometimes the villains in our stories aren't villains at all, just humans working with incomplete information, making decisions that ripple out into devastation. I've spent years carrying anger toward that doctor, imagining him as someone who callously judged my wife based on appearances. Now I understand he was probably just someone who thought he saw something obvious and made a decision based on that assumption. It doesn't make what happened right, but it makes it human. And maybe that's the hardest part of growing older. Realizing that our deepest wounds sometimes come from simple misunderstandings rather than intentional cruelty. In the end, this isn't just a story about loss. It's about how understanding can come to us years later, walking down a street on an ordinary day when we least expect it, and how sometimes that understanding doesn't heal the wound, but it helps us carry it differently. Story 12. Here's the thing about grief. It follows you everywhere, even to cruising altitude. I hadn't planned to spend my vacation savings on first-class tickets to a funeral. My cousin had died of COVID, and I found myself crossing the country to say goodbye. The comfortable seat was meant to be a small mercy, a cushion against the weight of loss I was carrying. 4.5 hours into the return flight, I was trying to lose myself in true crime podcasts when the first ripple of what was to come reached me. There was commotion at the back of the plane. I ignored it, or tried to. Then came the tap on my shoulder. "Excuse me," the flight attendant said, gesturing for me to remove my headphones. "You're flying under the honorific of Reverend. Are you a minister?" Let me explain something about that title. Back in 2000, I got ordained through the Universal Life Church to officiate my sister's wedding. Since then, I'd married 6 couples. It was convenient. And since airlines often required honorifics, and the only non-binary options were usually doctor or reverend, I'd chosen the latter. It was technically true, even if it wasn't the whole truth. "Yes," I answered, because it wasn't exactly a lie. "Can you please follow me?" That's when I heard it, the muffled sounds of someone crying. My mind jumped to last rites, which was ridiculous because I wasn't that kind of reverend. I wasn't any kind of reverend really, but I followed anyway. At the back of the plane sat a woman, probably in her mid-60s, her face red and swollen from crying. Other passengers hovered awkwardly nearby, while a second flight attendant wore the expression of someone who had run out of solutions. "This woman is experiencing a spiritual crisis," my flight attendant explained. She asked if there was anyone religious on board who could help. I looked at the woman, really looked at her. Grief recognizes grief. I knew that devastated expression. I was wearing a softer version of it myself. I should have said no. I wasn't qualified. I was an atheist with degrees in religious studies and philosophy. I wanted to return to my seat, my podcast, my bubble of carefully maintained solitude. Instead, I said, "I'm not a practicing reverend, but I can listen." Her name was Lydia, and she was returning from her son's funeral. Her husband took my first-class seat. He looked like he needed the respite, while I sat with her. For the next 4 hours, she told me about her boy, about his childhood misadventures, his college years when he thought selling pot made him a drug kingpin, his wedding, his career. She laughed between tears. Sometimes I laughed with her. Sometimes we just sat in understanding silence. Here's another truth about grief. Sometimes it needs a witness. Sometimes the person next to you on a plane becomes that witness, even if they're an accidental reverend who just wanted to be left alone. I've been annoyed at first, being pulled into someone else's pain when I was trying to manage my own. But sitting there with Lydia, I realized something. Grief might follow us everywhere, but so does the capacity for connection. Sometimes the most sacred moments happen when we least expect them, at 35,000 feet, between a grieving mother and an atheist reverend who just happened to be there. It wasn't the peaceful flight I'd hoped for when I booked that first-class ticket. It was better. It was real. It was human. And yes, maybe the flight attendant shouldn't have put me on the spot like that. Maybe she wouldn't have asked a physicist to perform heart surgery just because they had doctor before their name. But I'm glad she did, because sometimes the universe has a funny way of putting us exactly where we need to be, even if we're wearing the wrong title when we get there. Story 13. I'm going to tell you something, and you have to promise not to laugh. Though honestly, you probably should laugh, because this whole situation is ridiculous in that absolutely mortifying way that only real life can deliver. So here's the deal. I'm a part-time security officer while I work on getting my pilot's license. Pretty cool, right? Well, it was cool until yesterday morning when I managed to accidentally start an HR investigation with Finish. Yes, you read that correctly. Finish. It started when I was doing my regular patrol rounds and ran into my friend Sarah in another department. We got talking about languages because we both speak Russian, and I mentioned living in Latvia for a bit during an internship. Sarah's co-workers were sitting nearby, getting drawn into our conversation, and I started gushing about my week-long trip to Helsinki, Finland. The Finnish people were absolutely amazing, I told them, getting excited like I always do when talking about my travels. I described staying in this area called Leppäsilta near Helsinki, and how incredibly nice everyone was. Want to know something cool? I asked them. A local taught me how to say, "Hey, how are you?" in Finnish. This is where everything went sideways. I said the phrase, "Hey, mitä kuuluu?" and suddenly the whole atmosphere changed. One of Sarah's co-workers, let's call her Maria, looked absolutely shocked. Then another co-worker, who speaks both English and Spanish, gave me this look that could freeze lava. "You shouldn't say things like that," she said, "especially not at work." I blinked multiple times. Wait, what? But no one would explain what was wrong. They just stopped talking to me. Complete silence, the kind that makes you want to sink through the floor. 20 minutes before my shift ended, my phone buzzed. Text from my boss, HR meeting Monday morning. Apparently, unknown people had reported me for using Spanish slurs. Spanish slurs? Me? I don't even speak Spanish. The weekend was basically 48 hours of pure anxiety. Thank goodness Sarah texted to say she'd back me up, but still. HR meeting because Finnish sounds like something not great in Spanish. Monday morning arrived and there I was, sitting in a conference room with two HR representatives, my boss, my supervisor, who between us is not my biggest fan, and Maria's manager. They started by saying they were investigating reports of sexually charged language at work. I actually laughed. I couldn't help it. The whole thing was so absurd. I don't speak Spanish, I told them. Like, at all. I showed them the Finnish phrase written on an index card, explained about my time in Eastern Europe, even suggested they Google translate it if they wanted proof. My boss, who is actually pretty great, spoke up for me. He doesn't speak Spanish, that's documented. How could he have said anything in Spanish? After some back and forth and 20 minutes of me waiting in the hallway, fun times, they called me back in. Turns out there had been a miscommunication. No kidding. The good news, I'm not in trouble. The bad news, I'm now officially scared to speak anything but English at work. My boss said I don't have to patrol that department anymore, which is good, I guess, but also kind of awful. The worst part is I'm probably going to stop hanging out with Sarah. We were supposed to have lunch with her and her boyfriend on Thursday, but my wife and I decided it's better to keep my distance, at least until I finish my pilot training and can move on. Here's what I've learned. Sometimes life throws you curveballs. Sometimes those curveballs involve international incidents caused by perfectly innocent Finnish phrases. And sometimes the best thing you can do is keep your head down, do your job, and dream about the day you'll be flying planes instead of walking security rounds. But seriously, who knew Finnish could be so controversial? Story 14. Okay, so this is the story of how I accidentally sent my boyfriend to the ER. And yes, this literally just happened, like hours ago. I should probably tell you that we're both 18, I'm a trans guy, and my boyfriend is basically the sweetest human being who has ever existed. Which makes this whole thing even more mortifying, but also kind of hilarious. I mean, he thinks it's hilarious. I'm still dying inside. So here's the thing about my boyfriend. He's really enthusiastic about showing affection. Like, really enthusiastic, which is great, usually, until it's not. And this morning is when it definitely was not. We were just hanging out, being totally normal humans when things got romantic. And I was feeling super confident for once, which almost never happens. And he was being his usual enthusiastic self and everything was going great until it wasn't. So I have this thing where my legs kind of do their own thing in certain moments. Usually I can control it, I swear. But today, my friends, today my legs decided to go full anaconda. There was this horrible crack sound, and that was the moment I realized my thighs had just turned into a bear trap with my boyfriend's head caught in the middle. When he finally managed to escape from what I'm now calling the thigh prison incident, his face was doing this weird thing where he could only talk while holding his jaw at this specific angle. He looked like he was trying to do a really bad James Dean impression, except it wasn't an impression at all because, oh my God, I actually dislocated his jaw. The pain kept getting worse and worse, so we had to make an emergency trip to urgent care, which turned into a trip to the ER, which turned into, yeah, you're going to need an oral surgeon tomorrow morning. They're literally going to have to knock him out to fix it. I am dying of guilt. But this absolute legend, he's been making jokes about it the entire time. Who does that? Who gets their jaw dislocated and then starts making puns about it? My boyfriend, apparently. He keeps saying, worth it. I'm not even kidding. He has said this at least 20 times now, including through text from the pharmacy where he's picking up his pain meds. So yeah, that's how I sent my boyfriend to the ER. That's how I became the first person in history to dislocate someone's jaw through the power of affection. That's how I learned that maybe being super relaxed isn't always the best idea. And that's how I found out that my boyfriend is literally the most understanding person on planet Earth. If anyone needs me, I'll be stress eating my way through his oral surgery tomorrow morning, and probably researching ways to make it up to someone whose jaw you accidentally dislocated, because somehow a gift basket doesn't quite cut it. Oh wait, my phone just buzzed. It's another text from him. Still worth it. I literally cannot with this guy. Story 15. Let me tell you about the time I learned I was absolutely spectacularly wrong about everything I thought I knew about my own body, and pizza, especially pizza. Picture 10-year-old me sitting there with an inexplicable rash blooming across my knees and elbows like some sort of pepperoni-induced curse, because that's what I decided was happening. The pepperoni was clearly the villain here, not the pizza itself. Pizza would never betray me like that. Spoiler alert, pizza was totally betraying me. Fast forward to my young adult years, when I developed what I can only describe as the digestive system of an overexcited puppy. You know how some people have an inside voice? Well, I had decided I didn't need an inside anything. My stomach had its own agenda, and that agenda was chaos. I'm just really healthy, I'd tell myself while making my 4th bathroom trip of the day. Those other women who only go once a day, clearly they're the weird ones. Narrator voice, they were not the weird ones. My dating life became an elaborate dance of strategic positioning and creative excuses. Being the little spoon? Absolutely not. That was a danger zone I wasn't willing to risk. Instead, I mastered the art of the swift exit, the convenient door placement, and the casual, "Oh, did you hear something? Must have been the wind." It was never the wind. Now, any reasonable person might have questioned why their stomach was auditioning for a one-organ percussion band, but not me. No, I diagnosed myself with IBS and declared case closed. After all, my favourite foods, coffee, spicy dishes, and anything drowning in fat were typical IBS triggers. Mystery solved. Reader, the mystery was not solved. Things escalated at my manager's wedding. Picture this. There I was, surrounded by joy and celebration, and all I could think about was how I hadn't pooped in 2 days. While others were dancing, I was in my hotel room, eating bananas like they were going extinct and praying for gastrointestinal mercy. I got a special mention in the thank you card for attempting to dance while severely constipated, not exactly the legacy I was hoping for. This whole situation reminded me of my ex-boyfriend from university who had celiac disease. Once we ended up in the emergency room because his stomach pain was so bad we thought something had burst. Turns out he just needed enough laxatives to empty a small elephant. Did this ring any bells for me? Of course not. That would have been too logical. The final straw came when my stomach decided to go full drama queen. 1 minute I'd be fine, the next I'd look 6 months pregnant with a food baby that refused to budge. I was losing weight because eating had become an extreme sport. The pregnancy tests were coming back negative faster than I could buy them. Then, one day, while doing my best impression of a whoopee cushion trying to release a burp, I had an epiphany. Hey, I thought, this is exactly what my ex used to do when he ate gluten. And then, like a bolt of gluten-free lightning, it hit me. Fun fact, if you have a close family member with celiac disease, your chances of having it jump from 1 in 100 to 1 in 10. You know who has celiac disease? My sister. The same sister I'd been meaning to call about her new cat while I was busy ignoring all these obvious signs. So, I did what any suddenly enlightened person would do. I went cold turkey on gluten. And wouldn't you know it, my stomach stopped its one-organ rebellion. The bloating vanished. I could sit in a room without planning escape routes. I even felt awake enough to actually call my sister about that cat. The doctor's appointment is next month, but between you and me, I think pizza might have been the betrayer all along. And that's the story of how I learned that sometimes the answer to your problems isn't just blaming the pepperoni. Sometimes you have to look at the whole pizza. Thanks for watching, everyone. If this story made you laugh, cry, or cringe, make sure to smash that like button and let me know in the comments which part hit you the hardest. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories that will make your day seem a whole lot better. See you in the next one.